Welcome everyone to this second National Sheep Pregnancy Scanners Workshop. Great, and thanks very much for everyone who's listening tonight. That's quite big numbers. Basically, this workshop is really part of this project that I lead. And if I just go to the second slide, the project is increasing lambing percentages through better use of pregnancy scanning technology. We got it underway in August 2019 and basically then ran into COVID, of course. So that's had its impact. But basically the main work we're trying to do in this project is really overcome key barriers to adoption to scanning by firstly strengthening the business case for scanning, and then secondly, working actively with pregnancy scanners. And so we can better understand your needs and challenges that you face and provide targeted resources based on those needs. So we're very open to any ideas or whatever that you may have. The next slide is really just some background information as to why we're doing the project. I mean, basically, roughly about 69% of sheep producers, and this is a survey done roughly 5 years ago now, do not scan for litter size, so they can't actually target nutrition according to litter size or specifically cater for it. The key reasons why people say they're not scanning is based on about 600 producers, of which about half said they weren't scanning, is that in summary, really they say the business case is weak. Roughly about 50% or just under. Another 16% reckon that's impractical in their particular farming system, and about 12% of people think their current performance is okay. They're the main reasons why people gave for not scanning. Those numbers may have changed, we're not sure. But for tonight, basically I've just listed here the main project activities, and the presenters are going to present against each of those tonight. Firstly, the comprehensive economic analysis, John Young from Western Australia is going to present. The business cases, elaborating on the business case for scanning, Hamish Dixon, who's written those business cases, will present. Hamish, by the way, is now just outside Orange. And then engaging pregnancy scanner contractors. We've already done the survey. There were there was another workshop run in July 2021. So Gordon is going to present the online video resources that we've developed during the project. And just listed there the other activities we've been doing work with producer groups, Merino Link in New South Wales, the Bros Improved Grazing Group here in South Australia, and the MacKillop Farm Management Group basically in the southeast of South Australia, and they creep over into Victoria. And there's been a range of extension activities earlier this year, 10 workshops, 3 webinars, and 5 consultant updates. And then lastly, because it's pretty topical this year with a higher incidence being noticed of fetal resorption in some areas, and Gordon assures me it's right across New South Wales and even in Tasmania. Carolyn Jacobson from Murdoch University is going to talk about fetal losses, what's normal and what are the causes. And then just finally, I'll just leave you with some of the resource and extension materials that will be a sort of legacy of this project. Firstly, there'll be business case fact sheets. Key extension messages have been developed, and slide presentation packages will be available. There'll be the online video resources of scanning imagery, and we're also developing a training manual resource for sheep pregnancy scanners. And we'll advise you where to find those once those have been completed.
So our next speaker is John Young. John is the principal of Farming Systems Analysis Service based in Western Australia, and has been working as a livestock farming systems modeller and undertaking economic analyses for the Australian livestock industry for more than 30 years. For much of that time, John managed a mixed farming operation at Kojonup, and so brings wealth of practical farming experience to his economic consultancies. He was involved in the project that's been led by Forbes and has carried out a detailed economic evaluation of the contribution that pregnancy scanning can make to profitability. He will provide you with a summary of the findings and the important management changes that farmers need to make to capture these potential benefits.
What I want to present is sort of, I think, 3 different angles to give viewers, scanners, when you're firstly talking to your current clients about how they might get better use of the results that you're giving them. The second is, as Forbes mentioned, that for the people who aren't scanning, a lot of them aren't scanning because they said they don't see the sort of business case or the economic imperative to scan. So hopefully this presentation will, if you're talking to them, give you a bit more detail about why we think it is profitable for farmers to scan. And the third angle is that for people who like to think of themselves as evidence-based consultants, that we're going to be putting these results into a journal article that will be in the scientific literature, so that it's referable by consultants and anyone who reads the scientific literature. So in order to do that, we've carried out a fairly comprehensive economic analysis to address a lot of situations, and part of the problem that we were seeing when we started was that there was mixed messages out in industry, that different people were saying scanning is profitable, some others were saying scanning isn't profitable, and so we thought that part of that could have been because people were talking about different regions, different flocks, different prices, different times of lambing. So we've set out to do an analysis to cover off on all those bases. So these are the financial benefits that we've incorporated into the analysis. So the top 2, the selling passengers and adjusting feed allocation to the pregnant ewes, you can get those benefits by just scanning for pregnancy status or scanning wet dry. But the other advantages, feed allocation to the multiple bearing ewes, paddock allocation for multiples versus singles, and management of the replacements or selection of multiples in preference to singles as high reproduction replacements, they're only possible for producers who are scanning for multiples. So we'll come back to those 5 different sources of benefit and look at the magnitude of them and look at what's required in order to capture them. But there's also some non-financial benefits as well, and obviously you haven't incorporated these into the dollar value, but nonetheless they're real benefits that farmers can get from the information you're providing to them. It allows them to be more proactive about animal welfare, and animal welfare can pay on the bottom line as well. So we've incorporated the benefits of improving lamb survival and ewe survival for what that does for income, but there's also a benefit purely from an animal welfare point of view, and maybe that in future may become something that's paid for through market access, but at the moment it's more of an advantage for producers to feel good about the production system that they're operating. The scanning results also can give them a focus for improving the reproductive results. If they're about trying to improve the reproduction outcome on their property, we know that reproductive wastage can happen at a number of points along the reproduction process, and by scanning in mid-pregnancy, it gives a picture of whether that reproduction loss is happening at joining or whether it's more likely to be happening at lambing is the problem. So it allows farmers to focus in on where they might put their management if they want to improve reproduction as a way of improving profit. It also helps a bit of management, sort of proactive management, to prepare a feed budget in advance because they've got an idea of how many lambs are coming onto the ground. It can also help early detection of reproductive failures. So this doesn't hasn't occurred to too many people, but when it does, it has a big effect. If you've had a reproductive failure either because of disease or bad heat stress during joining, that scanning gives you a capacity to take some action a bit earlier. So perhaps the ability to remake the empty ewes or being more proactive about a disease that might be unfolding. So they're real benefits, but not ones that have been incorporated into the analysis that I'm about to present. The analysis mentioned that we were trying to do a fairly comprehensive analysis, and we've covered 4 different regions based on growing season length in the southern areas. So a 9-month growing season, a 6.5-month growing season, and then a cereal sheep zone with a sort of 4.5 to 5 month growing season, plus a summer rainfall region, sort of northern New South Wales. We've also looked at a range of time of lambing, sort of an early, mid and late time of lambing, a few different genotypes, merino mated to a terminal, which you might know is a dual purpose flock, and then also a maternal type, so a composite maternal. And then within those genotypes, sort of low, average and high reproduction rates, either to reflect different genotypes or different management capacity. And then we did a range of prices and sort of low, medium and higher prices, and those ones on the screen, $5.65 for lamb per kilo, 1,300 cents a kilo for wool, and supplement at $300 a tonne. That was the middle of the road prices that we used in the analysis. And we also incorporated some costs that we tried to represent sort of commercial reality. So scanning at sort of 75 cents per ewe, plus some travel for if you're scanning multiples, and a little less if you're just scanning for pregnancy status. Then some on-farm labour for mustering and pushing the ewes through the scanning crate, so allowed 30 cents a ewe for that. And then also some repairs and maintenance for the infrastructure, so the yards and the laneways that are getting a bit more of a workout because there's another job happening for the year. So we think we've been pretty realistic in the costs that we've included in the analysis. So let's have a look at the results. What actually came out of the analysis. At the standard prices that were on that previous slide, the increase in profit per ewe scan was $5.75. And if we looked at, we did a sort of current price scenario as well, and that was sort of done back in January 22 using current prices then, and the increase in profit per ewe scan was much higher, in line with much higher prices that are being achieved at the moment compared with that long-term average price of $5.65 per kilo for lamb. The lamb price is the main one that drives profitability of scanning, and that's a 70th percentile price for lamb over the last 20 years. So it's a bit below where prices are currently, and quite a bit below where they were in January this year. So using the long-term average, or the $5.65, the sort of standard price scenario, that's getting a return on investment of around 400% for farmers by incorporating scanning and then utilising the information that you provide to them. So that's showing that that's a very high return on investment, and it's really indicating that scanning is a low-cost tool that has a good return. And the thing that was sort of probably most telling for us was that all the scenarios we tested, so that we looked at on that last slide, there was sort of 300 to 400 different scenarios of region, time of lambing, genotype, and all of them, not one of them, showed a reduction in profit as a result of scanning. So in every case, the increased income was greater than the increased costs. And so we think that's quite an important finding, that in some cases the increase in profit may not have been very large, but in no times was the service that you're offering sort of reducing the farmer's profitability. Now, the $5.75 may not seem like a very large number. That's dollars per ewe scan, but so for a typical flock of sort of around 3,000 ewes, that's an extra $17,000 of profit per year. So that's after paying your contract bill, plus paying for the labour or remunerating themselves for working a bit harder in the yards, plus covering the repairs and maintenance on the yards. And at current prices, that's sort of up more at $30,000 extra profit per year. So for an average flock, it's a reasonable increase in income. And we talked a bit about the scenarios that were tested. This is 27 of the sort of 300 to 400 scenarios we tested for the current price scenario. And this slide is just to give you a bit of an idea of the range. So on that slide, there's sort of the lowest value is down in the short growing season merinos at $1.20, and the highest value is the long growing season merino at $10.60. But generally, lambing a little earlier has a higher, or for those who lamb earlier, the value of scanning is a little bit higher, because the capacity to sell those dries before the main feed shortage. For people who are lambing in spring, then by the time they find out that which ewes are dry and which ones are pregnant, they've pretty much missed the main feed shortage. So there's a little less benefit to be gained. But so we looked at those 5 different benefits before. They still get the benefit from the other 4, just not that one about feed allocation to the dry ewes. So this is how those 5 different potential benefits or management changes that farmers can make affect the bottom line. So we said that there's sort of $5.75 of benefit. If we add those numbers up, they come to $5.80. So I've done a little bit of rounding. But what we see is about half the benefit. So the top 2, sell the passengers and feed allocation to the pregnants and dries, is about half the value. And then the other half of the value can only be achieved if you're scanning for multiples. Now, what I mean by selling the passengers, so that is the dry ewes that aren't contributing to reproduction in the flock for this year. And we know from research in the Passengers versus Performers project that looked at sort of 4 different research flocks that had the information that would allow working out what would happen if you culled the passengers as far as future reproduction, because the ones that are dry this year are more likely to be dry next year as well. And so selling them this year means that in future you get a higher reproduction. It doesn't end up being quite as good as it seems like it's going to be on the surface, because by selling more of your old ewes that are dry means you have to bring more young ewes into the flock as replacements, and that sort of takes away some of the potential benefit. But it's still quite a a big contributor to the value of scanning. Then there's the feed allocation to the pregnant ewes versus the dries. So this is really about feeding the dry ewes less, or perhaps even more likely selling them so that they don't require any feed. Either sell them at scanning so that you save that feed if for those who are lambing in sort of lambing earlier before the feed shortage hits, or if you're a merino producer lambing a little later, then the likely thing to do is to carry those dry ewes through to shearing and then sell them at shearing. Then there's the feed allocation to the multiples. So this is out of the research from the Lifetime Wool Project, which is in the Lifetime Ewe Management program that a lot of farmers have done, and you may have done and know about feeding or having better condition score or higher condition score targets for the multiple bearing ewes compared with the single bearing ewes. And that gives an advantage of improving birth weight of the twins, which improves twin survival, and also it improves the wool production of those twins due to better in utero nutrition conditions. And also we know that more of the twin bearing ewes die at lambing, and so having better nutrition in late pregnancy also reduces that ewe mortality. So those three things are the contributors behind the benefit of feed allocation to multiples. And we also know from that same research, the Lifetime Wool trial that measured chill index and mortality of single and twin born lambs, and also other research carried out by CSIRO that quantified the effect of chill on lamb survival, that we know that twins are more sensitive to higher chill conditions than the singles are. The singles are more robust. And so if you know which ewes are carrying singles and which ones are carrying twins, you can put your twin bearing ewes in the better paddocks, and they'll give you a better improvement than the cost that you incur from putting the singles in the poorer paddocks. And so that contributes another dollar per ewe to the benefit of scanning for multiples. And then the last benefit, managing the replacements or selecting the replacements, that we know from research that an animal that's born as a twin will produce more lambs for its lifetime than a ewe that's born as a single, and roughly around an extra 10% increase in reproduction rate or scanning percentage for its lifetime. But if people aren't scanning and they don't know which ones were single born and which one was twin born, what tends to happen is that the twin born lamb or weaner or hogget, depending on when they're doing their selection, actually get culled at a higher rate because they're a little bit smaller and they don't look quite as good. So they actually get taken out of the flock, whereas they're actually a more productive, at least from a reproduction point of view, they're the more productive of the animals and should actually be slightly selected towards rather than selected against in those reproduction. And so that contributes about another dollar per ewe to the value of scanning. So the picture is that the benefits of scanning are quite broad. And what we found was across the scenarios that we tested, in some cases, one or other of those benefits might be down, but another one would increase. So they didn't all go down together. They went down, some went down, some went up across the different scenarios, and they buffered each other out. So it was, as I said before, there was no scenario where scanning for multiples didn't pay. And it's because of the buffering of one of these benefits against the others. A couple of more of the details behind what was done in the analysis that might be of interest to you. That part of the project looked at the discrepancy or disagreement between scanning results and lambing results. Farmers sometimes use this as a reason why they don't scan, because they say, well, they see twins in their singles and singles in their dries, and so they think it's not, that the outcome isn't sufficiently good in order to do it. And the research that was carried out by Kim Bunter showed that that compared scanning results with mothering up, that there was about a 15% disagreement. In the analysis that I've carried out, I've put all of that down to either disagreement due to what's happened at the scanning operation, or that it's sort of abortion after scanning. So I've accounted for that as being all cost. But we also expect that from the way the research was carried out, that some of that 15% error is actually associated with the mothering up end of the equation. So it means that my analysis has overestimated this problem about the disagreement between scanning and lambing. But nonetheless, the cost that 15% disagreement came to was only 50 cents per ewe. So that compares with a benefit of $5.75. There's that 15% disagreement, which we think is an overestimate, is only worth 50 cents. So that means that scanning error is not a reason for farmers not to scan. It certainly is a reason to make sure that they present their ewes to you in the best way possible, so that you can be as accurate as possible. There is 50 cents extra to be made by doing it in a way that allows you to do a good job, but it certainly shouldn't be a deal breaker as to why they don't scan. What we found that scanning for pregnancy status only, it's profitable in most scenarios. It wasn't profitable in all scenarios, and one of those slides said you get about half the total benefit from scanning wet and dry or pregnancy status as you do from scanning for multiples, and in some situations it doesn't pay. There was generally a higher value for scanning if you're scanning prior to the main feed shortage, so sort of earlier lambing flocks. And if you're a merino flock, then there was a little bit of extra benefit associated with the lifetime wool benefits that we talked about. And something that perhaps took us a little bit by surprise was that there was little impact of reproduction rate or scanning percentage on the value of scanning. And part of that was because if you've got a flock with a lot of dry ewes, then you get more benefit from being able to manage the passengers, and more benefit from controlling the nutrition of the dries. And if you've got more multiples, then you get more benefits from managing the nutrition of the multiples, paddock allocation, and selection of replacements. So this graph shows sort of as reproduction rate increases across the graph from left to right, then the value of managing the empties or the dries reduces, but the value of managing the multiples goes up. So the combined value doesn't really change all that much. So there's not really an argument to not scan if you're particularly have a high scanning flock, and you think we've got very few dries, so there's nothing in scanning for me, then that's not the case, because there's those other benefits from managing the multiples that are very important for that sort of flock. And I think it's more obvious that low reproduction flock with lots of dries, I think people are sort of aware that there's benefits that can be achieved in that sort of flock. So the conclusion that we draw from the analysis is that that scanning for multiples increase profit in all scenarios. So we think it's something that there's sort of financial reasons for most producers to do it. I forgot to say at the beginning, but this analysis was only done for the agricultural regions. It didn't cover the pastoral zone. So this conclusion is not sort of related to the pastoral zone. And the average increase in profit was around $5.75 per ewe, with a range between sort of $1.20 up to $11, with an average return on investment of 400%, which is a pretty solid return on investment. And again, indicating that scanning is a low cost, high value thing that ought to be happening on farm. The scanning for multiples was twice the value of scanning for pregnancy status only, and for the average flock. And that scanning for pregnancy status only was profitable in most scenarios. So we do see that scanning for pregnancy status is a good way for farmers who haven't scanned before to put a toe in the water and work out sort of what's involved in the operation of scanning before they sort of jump in and do the whole operation by scanning for multiples, which then means there's sort of extra mobs to keep track of and extra management that's involved. So that's the sort of financial part of the presentation, but there's a little bit more that because scanning for pregnancy scanning is only profitable if you capture the benefits that are possible from having the information. The information in itself doesn't increase profit, it's what you do with it. And so there's some actions that the farmers need to take. And this might be where, when you're talking to some of your clients, you can see if there's actions that they're not taking and perhaps leaving a bit of money on the table from the information that you're providing to them. So we see that it's necessary to remove the empties from the flock, reduce the feed in late pregnancy to the empties, and increase feed to the multiples. And then paddock, they need to allocate the lambing paddocks to the better lambing paddocks to the multiples, and which might also mean reducing mob size for multiples, because we know that the multiple the lamb survival of multiples is more sensitive to mob size than it is for singles, and select the replacement used, accounting for birth type. So removing the empties from the breeding flock, what we found was best there. Getting blinded by the sun coming in the window. That sell the once dries if the flock can self-replace. So we know from the research flocks that were analysed that selling once dry leads to a bigger increase in reproduction than selling twice dry, but it does mean that you're selling perhaps up to 4 times as many dries per year than if you just do twice dry. But if the flock can self-replace, and that probably is around about a scanning percentage of 90% or more, so that means there's not too many dries in the flock, and there's also a lot of replacements coming through. So that was more the most profitable option. And if the flock couldn't self-replace, then to switch to selling twice dries. And the best time to sell was affected by the time of scanning relative to the break of season. So if you're scanning prior to the main feed shortage, then sell at scanning. If you're scanning after, if you're a merino scanning after the main feed shortage, then keep the ewes through till shearing and take the wool before you sell them. And if you're a maternal, then sell at scanning, because there's very little benefit in wool income, particularly at the moment. And then there's also an impact of seasonal conditions, even for merino producer who might normally keep their dries through the shearing to get the wool income. If it's a particularly tough year, it may still be worthwhile selling those at scanning. This is about the targeted feeding and feed allocation and the targets. So this is sort of information that's adding to the information in the lifetime new management program that's doing the rounds of the farming community. So it's obviously reduced feed in late pregnancy to any empties that are retained, either because you're retaining them to shearing or you're retaining them because you're selling twice dry, and increase the feed to the multiples in late pregnancy. So the lambing targets would be for the empty ewes to be anything up to a condition score lighter than the single bearing ewes at lambing. So how much lighter than the singles depends a lot on how the season is turning out, but up to a condition score lighter. And then the multiple bearing ewes, so 0.3 to 0.5 of a condition score higher at lambing looks about right. So if they weren't identified at scanning and they were the singles and the multiples run together, then those multiple bearing ewes would be sort of 0.3 to 0.5 of a condition score lower than the single bearing ewes would be at lambing. So we're talking about sort of half to 1 condition score higher for the twins than they would have been. And then by weaning, those gaps have closed up. So then the last few examples were allocate the better lambing paddocks to the multiples, perhaps reduce mob size, and also keep the singles and the multiple born lambs separate when you're selecting the replacements. So farmers need to in order to get the full benefit that we've incorporated in this, calculated in this analysis, they need to do those 6 things that are on the screen.
Hamish is the principal consultant for AgriPartner Consulting and has over 15 years of experience in the agricultural industry, working in roles both on farm and off. Hamish has specialist knowledge of both extensive and intensive ruminant production systems and works in the industry through consulting, training, and research in sheep and cattle nutrition and management.
Look, that's a brilliant, I guess, lead on from John in terms of, I guess, the progression within the project and the development of the business case documents. Effectively, what I'm going to go through is really looking at, I guess, just the background to the business case documents, which are effectively part of the extension of this project, or one component of the extension. Really what the business case documents are aiming to do is to take all of the work that John's done in terms of the economic analysis and put that into effectively a couple of extension materials that can be utilised by many of yourselves and utilised by producers. It's taking that core economic information and then basically building out, well, how do we actually utilise that information on farm? What are the ways that it can be used? How do we implement it? Effectively, in many ways, when you go back to probably some of that survey work that Forbes presented around the issues or the barriers about, is there actually really a cost benefit? Or I think even when you see a response, something like that it's an impractical practice that farmers think that pregnancy scanning can be, ultimately, I think in many situations, that's really pointing towards the fact that they don't see a strong enough cost benefit. So it's taking this economic analysis work and basically moving it forward into how can we create a resource that producers can pick up really easily and go, okay, here's the cost benefit. But also, if I'm going to seriously look at implementing pregnancy scanning, whether it's starting to pregnancy scan or to progress from potentially pregnancy scanning just for status, simple wet dry, to moving on to pregnancy scanning for multiples, what are the really important pieces of information that I need to know in terms of how to implement that? So, like I said, this is one part of the extension. associated with this project, and Forbes went through a little bit of the other aspects of that, including, you know, some of these webinars are part of that. But from the business case document perspective, what we're looking at is 3 different business case documents that will be developed out of this project. And there's a little bit of extra work going on at the moment with Sue Hatcher about potentially doing a couple of expanded ones as well. But these 3 core business case docs are what will come out once this project is fully published. Effectively, what we did is we thought, okay, well, what are some of the really common scenarios that producers are going to be wanting to know about? And there's a bit of a balance between putting so much information into these sorts of things that producers don't necessarily want to pick it up and spend time really going through it, and making it really simple and easy enough that they can pick it up, get the core information that they need to really consider pregnancy scanning in the best way, and then move on. So what we looked at is, okay, effectively, let's do a pregnancy scanning for pregnancy status. So just scanning for empty and pregnant. Another document looking at scanning to identify litter size. What are the really key considerations around that, and what are the benefits? And then the other one is, okay, well, what are some of the other aspects of pregnancy scanning, and what are some of the ways that producers utilize pregnancy scanning outside of the core activities of just knowing, okay, well, these ewes are dry, they're either going to get sold or have their once dry opportunity. These ones are pregnant, I'm going to feed them this way. There's other aspects to pregnancy scanning that many producers think about that can actually just help in that decision-making process too. So effectively, those were the 3 scenarios that we developed the business case documents for. The business case documents are really intended to be as concise as they can be. So they're about 2 to 3 pages long. They just contain some introduction information, some of the core cost benefit work that's come out of John's information, and then goes into detail about, okay, well, how do we pregnancy scan on farm? What are the really important considerations? And I'll go through that at the end, because that's obviously particularly important for all of you. And then it's, okay, well, how do we manage that data? What are we doing with the different groups of animals that are going to be effectively split at pregnancy scanning? How do we manage those different groups, and how do we gain the most benefit out of it? I think John made a really important point, which is something we want to drive home in these business case documents as well, which is, it's all well and good to pregnancy scan, but the benefit actually comes from utilising that information. And I think in my consulting work over the years, I've seen it quite a few times where producers sort of think or know that they want to be pregnancy scanning, but they're leaving a lot on the table in terms of fully utilising that information. So that's often the next step that they can really take to really fully utilise every bit of that information that they can gain out of pregnancy scanning. So in terms of looking at pregnancy scanning for pregnancy status, so just for pregnancy status, looking at effectively empty and pregnant, wet, dry, we're really looking at how we improve management of those 2 groups of animals. So for the dry animals, John's gone through a little bit of this. It's about really looking at what are the options for those dries, and that may well be sale of those dry animals. There's a bit of discussion there about really what's the timing of that look like. You know, in merino enterprises, there may be some opportunities there in terms of holding for a shorter period of time, depending on wool lengths, to get a shearing off. There may be opportunities in terms of potentially remating if the season's going that way and selling scanned-in lamb. There may be opportunities in terms of actually just quitting those animals quickly if it's a dry season. So there's opportunities there in terms of how those dries are managed if they're looking down the sale end for those animals. Potentially, if you're looking at a once dry scenario, then you move into that cycle of, okay, how much opportunity do we give these ewes to come back into the breeding flock? The other opportunity is then, what do we do with pregnants? So in this scenario where we're not actually capturing multiple information, we effectively now just have a grouping of animals that we know at least are pregnant. And there's some management there about potential for opportunity in terms of just better allocating feed, especially if you're keeping dry animals. You've got opportunities there in terms of just small changes to be able to effectively allocate feed better when you've got a dry mob running around, and you may have reduced your total, I guess, pregnant numbers or lambing numbers by 5, 10, 15%, whatever the dry percentage is that's come out of that flock. There's benefits there also that we talk about, I guess, in terms of things like early detections of joining failures. That's one of the opportunities that can come out of pregnancy scanning when you're just looking at pregnancy scanning for status. So cost benefits there. Like I said, that the economic analysis that John has done will produce a really comprehensive report that'll be available, and that'll probably provide one of a really good resource. What we're looking at in terms of these business case documents is really condensing that down into some of the core averages. And then for producers that are wanting to find out really detailed information, then there's obviously the full economic analysis information that they can follow up with after that. In terms of scanning for litter size, this would be the next version of the business case doc, which really expands on the first one to then look at, okay, if we're going to be able to capture multiple information, how do we best utilize that? And that's starting to work through and go, yep, we've got that same decision in terms of opportunities for better managing the dries, but how do we then look at managing those multiples? So one of the important things there is actually starting to look at, well, can we actually choose our lambing paddocks better? And that may well be partly for things like feed quality. It might be also in terms of considering aspects around shelter, privacy, the aspect of the country as well in terms of how appropriate it is for lambing as well. So there's certainly plenty of opportunities from that perspective. Understanding the litter size also gives producers lots of opportunity in terms of managing the nutrition and the feeding side. So we know there are significant differences between the nutritional demand of singles and twins, and same again once you step up to things like triplets. So it gives us plenty of opportunity in terms of allocating feed resources better between singles and twins. And that may or may not involve some supplementary feeding, but at the very least, it allows us to be able to better manage the nutritional demands of those two groups. The other really common aspect that comes into that at a core level of managing multiples is then really mob size. So if we know we've got a group of singles, we know we've got a group of multiples, we can start to reallocate our paddocks to reduce mob size. It doesn't necessarily always mean that we have to have more paddocks. There's many situations where simply reallocating the animals that we've got across our paddocks can still reduce the mob size for particularly the multiple bearing ewes. That often comes at the expense of bigger mobs in the singles, but we certainly know from years of data now that the singles are pretty resilient to bigger mob sizes, and you can push them a little bit higher to reduce mob sizes for the twins and gain an overall advantage in terms of lamb survival. So there's opportunities there when you have that information about litter size from a pregnancy scanning activity. Once again, we've seen cost benefits there and the average figures that come through when we can collect that data. The third scenario that will come out as part of the business case documents is looking at really pregnancy scanning in general and what are the broader benefits that can be gained from pregnancy scanning. I think one of the most common questions that I get is really, it starts at a core level of how do I improve my lambing rate? You know, that's probably the most common target for producers that we work with on. And one of the first questions that comes back after that is, okay, well where are we at? And that inevitably just leads down the path of saying, okay, well, where are we at for lamb marking rates? And then trying to determine realistically, where are the losses occurring? And that's an important piece of information that you can't understand if we don't have pregnancy scanning data. Because if we don't know what the conception rate is, and we don't know what the resulting lambing rate is, we don't know realistically whether our lamb survival rate is actually quite good because we haven't had many lambs on board to start with, or equally, or on the other side, whether the lamb survival rate is really low and we've actually conceived a really high number and maybe we've marked 100%, but we were conceiving at 170%. So understanding really what that fetal loss rate is like is a critical piece of being able to target management to improve the overall lambing rate. It really starts to fine tune the focus of whether we need to be thinking about how do we get more lambs on board in the first place, or is it a lamb survival issue at lambing time, or a combination of the two. So having pregnancy scanning and having that data is actually a really important part of many businesses' goals around how to improve lambing rate. And it's a tool in that process of moving forward. So I find in many scenarios, it's a discussion around, okay, what are your targets for the business? And many sheep producers may say, look, we're trying to improve lambing rate, we're trying to improve stocking rate. It might be about growth, it might be about wool. but inevitably, reproduction comes up. And if we haven't got the data to actually target management change, then it's a really difficult piece of the equation. So completely separate of all of those management aspects of things like, okay, are we going to reduce mob size with twinners? Purely from a data perspective in terms of targeting improvements in management, it's a critical piece of information and one of the benefits that you can gain from getting some pregnancy scanning data for producers. John went through things like improved assessment of replacement ewes, and that is certainly one of the benefits that is gained out of having pregnancy scanning data, to be able to at least estimate what the birth type of these animals are of our replacement ewes. Certainly for many commercial producers, they may not have full confirmation that, say, a replacement ewe lamb was reared as a twin, but at least to have some information to know that she may have well been born out of a twin bearing ewe can provide some better accuracy around the data of assessing that animal. It's a really common scenario, and John alluded to it quite well, which is that often it's our late twin-born lambs that get really unfairly penalised at classing time because they just don't have the same opportunity as the early single. So having some information like that you can gain from pregnancy scanning is a really important part of actually improving the accuracy of assessing our replacement ewes in many sheep flocks. The other benefit that can come in is, I guess, taking pregnancy scanning information another step further ahead, which is looking at fetal aging. And I guess there's a growing number of producers that are utilising that information. So the final business case document, certainly includes some information about how that type of information can be used on farms. And that may well be, like we say before, in terms of having good information on those replacement ewes. It might be about being able to better manage lambing time. So understanding, which group of ewes are potentially in the early window, which ones are in the late, potentially breaking up those animals into their lambing paddocks at a more defined time and being able to allocate labour resources in terms of monitoring lambing. Depending on the joining time, there's certainly producers that are using early, middle and lates in terms of allocating lambing paddocks and getting 2 cracks at some paddocks, with basically earlies going through, drifting them out, and then lates coming through after that. So there's opportunities around fetal aging, and for many producers that's a few steps ahead of where they are, but at least it's some information there that producers can sort of see where potentially down the track, if they can see a cost benefit, they can sort of progress towards. One of the important parts of the business case documents is really looking at how do you implement pregnancy scanning on farm. And one of the big parts of this is really looking at cost benefit. And fortunately, all of the analyses and the range of inputs that have gone into the economic analysis will help producers to be able to look up, okay, well, what is the cost benefit of pregnancy scanning on our farm? I think John said there was a bit over 300 different scenarios there that were looked at in combinations within that economic analysis. So I think there's plenty of opportunity for producers to be able to see what the cost benefit is in a situation that's very similar to their own. The next step is really looking at, well, how does pregnancy scanning become implemented on our farm? And I think it's an easy thing to say, look, we're going to pregnancy scan, but it's an important step to go back a notch and go, okay, well, how will it actually work practically? What do I need to be thinking about prior to scanning? What do I need to have set up? How am I going to manage the information that comes out of pregnancy scanning, especially if they're getting to the point that they're looking at utilising electronic tags and trying to log that information? The last thing they need is to be rushing around on the day of scanning and really struggling to actually capture the information properly. So it's about, what will the decisions be that come out of pregnancy scanning? How am I going to manage those drives? How am I going to manage, potentially singles versus multiples? It's about really having a clear understanding of what that data will drive on the farm before they get to the point of pregnancy scanning in the first place. And that's really about understanding what the cost benefit is. I think if producers don't have a really clear end goal as to why they're pregnancy scanning and how that data will be used on farm, then they're really struggling in that first step to understand how they're going to get a cost benefit out of it in the first place. But on the other side, if they can see that, yep, if I can identify my twinners and I can manage those into their landing groups, or if I can better manage these dryers, I've got an end goal for where I'm going to be able to turn these dryers off to, then they can actually really grab the data that will come out of pregnancy scanning, manage their farm better, and actually generate a lot of those cost benefits, a lot of those profits that have come out of the modelling work from John's work. So that's a big part of really, I guess, what we want to focus on within those business case documents, is taking the cost benefit work and progressing it into some discussion around, okay, how do you actually implement it on farm? What are the really key considerations about making it work on your property? I think finally, one of the things that's worth looking at is, in terms of information really particular to pregnancy scanners, is having some information in those business case documents about how do you get a good result from pregnancy scanning. John went through a little bit of information in there around that sort of 15% disagreement between pregnancy scanning rate to lambing rate. And we're trying to basically minimise that and make sure that from a pregnancy scanning perspective, it's every opportunity is provided there to be as accurate as possible. And I think preparation of views for scanning is a really critical part of that. And this is the information that's effectively in there at this stage. And I think we're certainly open to input on that. But really the critical aspects to that is getting that timing right. I certainly know from a consulting perspective, there's been plenty of times that we've been digging into preg scan results and how that's married up with marking results. And if there's been a really big disagreement, by the time you start to dig back into, well, what actually happened or when we're scanning and all those sorts of things, it's not uncommon that I've seen that pregnancy scanning has been way out of the ideal window. So it's getting the whole scenario set up to be in the best way possible. So the right timing, making sure that stock are off feed and water from the night before, making sure that there's consideration about, we have to have labour there available to push up and keep the stock moving through. And equally having things like the yards in reasonable condition, especially when we start to look at, okay, we're considering how do we draft, maybe the dryers are taken off, maybe the multiples are kept separate, but ultimately we've actually got to have the yards in good enough condition to be able to do that. Seems like a simple thing, but I'm sure many of you have plenty of yards where, they're just not up to scratch in terms of being able to deliver the end result that we want in terms of keeping dryers separate. Whether it's a gate that's opened up and then we've got another group boxed in or whatever else it is, it's important to flag that and to make sure that that's on the radar in terms of just a practical component of making sure that we get a result out of it. And I think the final thing to keep in mind and something that Gordon raised is collection of EID data. And I think it's something to be thinking about and considering, is particularly with pregnancy scanning for multiples. I think many producers are starting to look at, yep, it's a decision year on year, but ultimately they want to be able to start logging that data and to be able to keep a repository of that information, to be able to look back potentially if things get dry, get tight, and they want to be able to go back through those ewes and understand which ones have been more consistently at least conceiving twins or multiples compared to those that have always been singles. If they're going to be investing in electronic ID, the next step is managing that data. And then the next step is, or the other consideration is how that information is collected at pregnancy scanning time. So I think we may well start to see, a little bit more interest from producers about using EID at pregnancy scanning time. I think that, much of the feedback that we had from this first pregnancy scanner webinar that we did a while ago was that many of you were seeing an increase in interest in it already. So I think that may well continue and is something to keep on the radar as well. I think that's the end of what I wanted to go through in terms of a summary of really what's happening with the business case documents, where they're headed in terms of the information that's contained in them, and how they basically are aiming to take a lot of the economic analysis work and moving that out to extending it into a way of producers being able to implement it on farm as best they can.
Caroline Jacobson. Caroline is a Murdoch University graduate. She has worked in private veterinary practices in Western Australia and the United Kingdom, and has over 20 years of experience in research focused on sheep and health production. She teaches animal nutrition, livestock health and production, to veterinary and animal science students at Murdoch University and is a member of the Western Australian Livestock Research Council.
Look, what I'm going to be doing today is providing a snapshot of some research that we've been doing since 2018. It was largely an MLA project, which was focused on improving effectively the reproductive performance of maiden ewes. So looking at ewe lambs and maiden ewes joined at 2 years old for the first time. And in that, one of the things that we were exploring was the role of fetal loss. So what I'm going to be talking to you today about is fetal losses, what is normal, and what are the causes from what we've identified with our recent research. There's certainly a ewe lamb component to this, and I can see John Young still in the crowd. So effectively, there's been quite a lot of crossover with some of the other ewe lamb projects. So at the end of this, what I'd like to do is basically, in the question time, call back onto John, who could talk about the ewe lamb decision support tool, which might answer some of the questions that we've been dealing with as well. So again, I'd just like to circle back to that at the end of this talk. So again, the work that I'm presenting today, it was done by a big team. And so I'd just like to credit, again, the team in Western Australia that were, I guess, leading some of the aspects, and especially Tom Clune, who some of you might have seen through some of, he's been doing some other presentations through Lifetime Ewe Groups. Also Andrew Thompson, Amy, Serena, but also the team at DPIRD. So some of the work that I'm presenting today was done by that group. So what I'd like to start with is a snapshot of what is normal in terms of fetal losses. And again, to give this some context, as part of this project, what we did is we surveyed effectively producers across Australia to look at what was their current level of lamb wastage, or fetal and lamb wastage, between scanning and marking in ewe lambs, and also 2-year-old merinos being joined for the, basically maiden ewe hogget merinos. So these are ewes being joined at 18 months to lamb for the first time at 2 years old. And we know that there's a wide variation in the survival and the marking rates and even the reproductive rates between farms. So what we were really interested in was let's say the difference or the gap between maidens and mature ewes on the same farm. And notably, what we found was that the marking rates were much lower in ewe lambs. So these were all the non-merinos that we're presenting here, so mostly composites. And so again, the marking rates were about 58% lower. And of that, most of that difference was coming from lower reproductive rate. So lower, basically, number of fetuses scanned in lamb. So about 50% difference, so 109% to 159% difference between the maiden ewe lambs and the adults on the same farm. But similarly, we've also got a difference or a lower level of lamb survival. So that's the survival of those fetuses through to marking. So again, talking about ewe lambs, yes, they do have a lower marking rate, and that's a combination of both lower reproductive rate, so lower number of lambs scanned or fetuses scanned, and then lower survival of those lambs through to marking. Similarly, if we look at our merinos being joined for the first time, again, to lamb at 2 years old, lower marking rates compared to the adults, but the magnitude of that gap is lower than what we saw with the ewe lambs. And again, that was a combination of both lower reproductive rate and lower survival of those lambs or fetuses and lambs through to marking. But again, much smaller differences than what we saw with the ewe lambs. Okay. So again, this is a way of presenting still the statistics, and what we can see here is so the ewe lambs are in green, the merino 2-year-olds are in blue, and effectively the line in the middle of the box shows us the median data, and the line with the little crisscross at the end shows us the quartiles. So that top line down to the start of the box is the top 25%. Inside the box, so the top of the box to the line within the box showed us basically 25 to 50%, and then so on. And what we can see is that we get like a big variation in both the survival of basically the fetus and the lamb. So between scanning through to birth and then through to marking, we see a big variation both in, I guess, the average or the median levels, but also between the top and the bottom 25%. So what this is telling us is that we see big variation in the survival for the lambs or the fetuses and the lambs born to maidens, whether they're coming from new lambs or from 2-year-olds. So again, what this survey told us, again, is that maidens have poorer reproductive scanning rate and poorer lamb survival. And so importantly, for farms that have disappointing marking rates in their ewe lambs or their 2-year-old ewes, is that we really need to differentiate where that's coming from, whether it's coming from reproduction rate, lamb survival, or a combination of the two on that farm, so that we've got solutions that are basically targeting the right place. Because again, if the problem is largely lamb survival, then that has quite different solutions to the problem is reproductive rate. And so it's important that we can differentiate the two. Particularly for the ewe lambs, the reproduction rate and lamb survival is highly variable, and it's not well correlated with the adults on the same farm. So what this is telling us is that particularly for ewe lambs is that we're going to need strategies that are targeted for the age group and the pregnancy type, so singles and multiples, rather than just replicating more of the same of what we see in adults. And that's particularly the case for the ewe lambs, is that we've got to start putting some nuance in to actually realise those benefits for joining those ewe lambs. And importantly, we saw really wide variability between the best and the worst farms, which, while that's, showing that we've got sort of wide variation, that we've certainly got opportunity to improve reproductive performance, because we know that this is achievable with the targeted strategies, because that is being already achieved by those top 25%. Okay. So what we did, that was some survey work. We actually conducted on-farm research where we were following flocks through. So these are maiden ewes on 28 farms, or 30 flocks on 28 farms. So we had, 28 of the, most of the farms, we just followed the maidens through in 1 year. And then in 2 of the farms, we followed them through in 2 years. The farms were located in WA, South Australia and Victoria. So pretty wide variation in rainfall pattern, climatic patterns. And we had a combination of ewe lamb flocks and merino hogget flocks. Now, importantly, we looked at these ewes basically at different times through the breeding cycle. We started pre-joining and at joining, and we recruited 200 ewes per site. We scanned them once at their standard time, so 35-day joining period, first scanning period, and then we scanned them again 30 to 40 days later after the first scan to see if we could capture fetuses being lost during mid-gestation. At most of the farms, we had fetal count conducted at birth, so where the lambs were being mothered up, and then again at lamb marking. So again, this is a study where we've followed them through at different stages, including repeat scanning about 40 days apart. Okay, so the overall, if we're just looking at the averages, in the ewe lambs, 36% of the lambs which were present at that first scan were lost between there and marking. And if we look at the lowest, or let's say the best survival we had, the lowest wastage, 14% loss, and the highest wastage, 71%. Similarly, in the hoggets, about 29%, which is very similar to the average. And again, wide variation between the best and the worst farms. Importantly, if we can separate out the losses which are occurring during pregnancy and those that are occurring effectively between birth and marking, again, what have we got here? We've got basically 19 ewe lamb farms. The height of the total height of the bar is the total loss of fetuses between scanning and lamb marking. So again, you can see we've got losses ranging from 70% down to about 15%. The red bar is the losses that were detected in mid-pregnancy. So that's between scan 1 and scan 2. And again, we followed up and confirmed with lambing records that the losses that were recorded between scan 1 and scan 2, went on and didn't lamb. So if we look at these mid-pregnancy abortions in the ewe lambs, mid-pregnancy abortion was confirmed in about 3/4 of the flocks, so about 75%. The mid-pregnancy abortion, so that's that first scan and 40 days later, above 2% was present in about 1 in 3 flocks. And up to 50% losses were detected during pregnancy in flocks where there was no evidence of clinical signs. So because these abortions were happening during mid-pregnancy, the fetuses were effectively being absorbed, or if they were being aborted and lost by the ewes, they were too small for the farmers to detect, and the ewes had no signs of illness or problems that would alert us to a problem. Again, just breaking this down, because we were able to break it down, the average fetal loss, so that's between the first and the second scan during mid-pregnancy, was about 6%. And that's if we either look at ewes or, ewes affected or fetuses affected. So it sits around 6%. The losses between late or that second scan and birth sitting around 11%. But again, we have to consider that these numbers are a bit rubbery because that will include late pregnancy abortions, so lambs which were basically aborted after the second scan and before birth, but it will also include lambs which were born and they're not recovered by the farmers or during lambing rounds, so usually because they've been scavenged. So again, we have to take that number, just recognising that it's not as accurate as mid-pregnancy abortion. And then again, about 18% of lambs being lost between birth and marking. So again, wide range, somewhere between 9 and 28%. And that gives us that overall 36% or 36 lambs out of 100 scanned being lost between scanning and marking. Again, if we look at the 2-year-old ewes, these were all merinos being joined for the first time to lamb at 2 years old. And again, we can see smaller number of flocks that we've included and much lower levels of these mid-pregnancy abortions. So again, the mid-pregnancy abortions are still being detected in, more than half of the flocks, but at much lower levels. So sitting well, well under that 5% level. So again, if we look at the 2-year-olds, much lower average loss and a much smaller range. So 0 up to about 5% of ewes affected, and then up to about 4% of the fetus is scanned. And again, very similar levels of, let's say, losses between, the second scan and the birth. And again, just accepting that that will include some lambs that weren't recovered. And again, about 20% lambs being lost between birth and marking. So what we found, from this sequential monitoring, is that mortality during the birth period and up to marking is still the major source of lamb loss for most flocks. So that's, again, very, very similar to what we found in most adult studies, where, that period around birth and those first 3 days is the most critical and the largest source of lamb losses. And what this tells us is that it's still important to understand the causes of those lamb deaths on a particular farm, because that's going to inform the strategies to improve survival. Because again, if dystocia is the major cause, then we need strategies to address dystocia. Similarly, if we've got undersized lambs, mismothering, then that's going to have a different set of strategies to offset and improve the survival of those lambs. Mid-pregnancy abortion is an important source of loss on some farms in some years, and especially for ewe lambs. So again, we've seen losses, up to 50% between, scanning and birth occurring, again, in flocks where it's not otherwise detected. So this could just show up as disappointing marking rates, and these flocks that we hear about where, disappointing marking rates where they're not obviously detecting a lot of dead lambs. So again, particularly for ewe lambs, what this tells us, about 1 in 3 flocks can be affected. And so we need to consider investigation, particularly for ewe lambs, to separate out abortions from the deaths that are occurring soon or during or soon after birth to inform our management strategies. And again, because addressing abortion, which again, we'll talk about the causes of abortion, will often have different solutions to addressing basically causes of lamb mortality that occur at birth and in those first 3 days. And finally, we can have 1 in 3 ewe lamb flocks with abortions higher than expected. But with all of that said, it's rare to find dead lambs even with an outbreak. So again, even looking back at those, those level of abortions that we were seeing, 20%, 50% fetuses being lost, we only recovered 1 lamb from each of those flocks. So the flock with 20%, we recovered one lamb with the mid-pregnancy abortion. The flock with 50%, we recovered 1, and that was with a lot of extra monitoring. So what this tells us is abortions are going to be, mid-pregnancy abortions are usually going to be underestimated. And if farmers are identifying any aborted lambs or fetal membranes during that mid-pregnancy abortion, investigation is warranted rather than waiting to see if you're going to find more dead lambs. Because as we know, even when we've got effectively abortion outbreaks, we're not always going to recover more lambs, particularly during that mid-pregnancy period. So what were the causes of this fetal and lamb loss? Well, effectively, we've got two sets of data that we're going to fall back on. The first is two reviews of historical lab data. So this is effectively where we've gone to the state laboratories, the veterinary laboratories, gone through their data, their records, and looked at all of the abortion and stillbirth investigations. And this data is now sitting in two studies, and we've compiled this together, and I'm going to present that today. So this information is freely available. It's in an MLA report for the Fetal Loss Project that's coming out, but we've also got the original research available in a paper that's open access in the Australian Veterinary Journal, and also a final report where Gordon was one of the authors that's also freely available for download. So this is what I'm presenting now. So when we combine these two studies together, the Veterinary Journal investigation that we conducted and Gordon's investigation in New South Wales, this covers 854 historical investigations, over the period that we could recover these from the database. And overall, what we find is that when cases are submitted to the veterinary laboratories, the pathologist can make a diagnosis in about half of those submissions. And again, what are some of the factors there? So when they could make a diagnosis and work out the cause, overwhelmingly, these were infectious causes, so bacterial or parasitic infections. And when we look at what the most commonly diagnosed causes were, these are Campylobacter. We've got Campylobacter, Listeria, and Toxoplasma. So these are the most common infectious causes that are identified. 21%, or about 1 in 5 cases, will have a non-infectious cause that can be made. And again, we've got this other 50% where the cause is not known at all. So what made it more or less likely that the pathologist could come to a conclusion about what was actually causing these abortions and stillbirths? Basically, if they had access to a placenta, they were twice as likely to make a diagnosis. Now, and again, sometimes those placentas are available, sometimes they're not. What was really problematic is when the only, let's say, blood samples that they have to rely on are blood samples. And in those cases, it's very, very challenging for them to retrospectively make a diagnosis about what was causing the abortions or lamb deaths. Importantly, I think sometimes what we found was autolysis, so that's basically rotting of the tissue, was present in 50% of the submissions, but the pathologists are still able to make a diagnosis in half of those cases. So what this tells us, we've got a placenta at the top, which is already pretty autolyzed, one at the bottom that's really, really autolyzed. But even when we've got these really autolyzed tissues, they can still do a lot of the PCR testing and the infectious disease testing and still get some useful information. So what we're doing now is encouraging farmers that even, particularly for these mid-pregnancy abortions, is to collect any tissues that you can, chill them, freeze them, whatever you need to do, and still consider submitting them to the laboratories so that they can make a decision about doing the testing. So if we go back to our study flocks, just going back, we had these 30 flocks, 19 ewe lamb flocks and 11 merino hogget flocks. And we conducted what we call serology. So this is blood testing, looking for antibodies to give us idea of exposure to different diseases. So within those 30 study flocks, we looked at nearly 1,300 of the maiden ewes, and we tested at least 40 ewes per flock. And what we were interested in was, is exposure to disease like one of these risk factors for these mid-pregnancy abortions or problematic lamb survival? And 3 of the diseases that we can test for with these antibodies, with these blood tests, are Toxoplasma, Neospora, which are 2 different types of parasites, and the bacteria Coxiella, which is the bacteria that causes Q fever. And what we found was that in our 30 study flocks, that the exposure to these parasites or bacteria were really low. So if we go back and look at the ewes that we sampled, most of them were failed to rear. We preferentially sampled abortion sheep and a very small number that reared a lamb. So effectively we were blood testing, let's say, our most problematic ewe lambs and maiden hoggets, and still found really low levels of exposure. So what this told us is that Toxoplasma, Neospora and Q fever were unlikely to be explaining the abortions and the lamb mortalities in these flocks. We also looked at Campylobacter, which is a bit trickier to test because Campylobacter is let's say it's commonly present in healthy sheep that don't have signs of disease. Now, when we do Campylobacter blood testing for antibodies, there's two types of Campylobacter that we can test for. So Campylobacter jejuni, we found basically on nearly all of the farms. So these antibodies are really common at marking. The presence of those antibodies or the amount of the antibodies, whether it was high or low in the blood, was not associated at all with failure to rear. And if anything, the higher levels of antibodies were more commonly found in the ewes that reared lambs. If we look at Campylobacter foetus, which is, let's say, the more dangerous version or the more dangerous strain, let's say, of Campylobacter, the ewe lambs, which were positive, so had a titer of 80 or higher, were 2 times more likely to fail to rear. But what we found was that the Campylobacter foetus antibodies that were detected at marking were not consistently associated with failure to rear. So we had some flocks or some animals with very high titers that successfully reared lambs. We had a flock with a known Campylobacter outbreak, where if we'd only tested those ewes at marking, we would have failed to detect that. So what this tells us is that if we're going to be using Campylobacter blood testing, is that the antibodies can rise and fall quickly during an outbreak, and we can basically miss actual problems, or we can overdiagnose problems which weren't actually there. So the lamb postmortems, testing those placentas or the dead lambs, and lab testing still remain the gold standard. And what it means is that we have to really carefully use those blood testing results to determine the risk for a particular farm. So it's not as simple as a one-off blood test. So of the 30 study sites that we had, we looked at, we actually did detailed postmortems for 11 ewe lamb flocks in Western Australia, and we did 300 lamb exams. And of these were lambs, these included lambs that were aborted or that were premature. And basically what we did was quite detailed testing to see, one, what was the cause of death using the necropsies or the postmortem exam, and then following up with lab testing. So again, a lot of our lambs had to be frozen before we could do the postmortem, but notwithstanding that, we could still get a cause of death for 76% of lambs. And if we group those into the classifications, the most common causes were still starvation, mismothering, exposure, dystocia, so difficult births, and stillbirths, which is really consistent with what we find in adult ewes. So again, we didn't have anything different in these maiden ewe mobs, which would make us think that, that there was something unusual about that farm compared to all of the other studies that have gone before it. We did some really detailed lab investigations, again, looking at a whole heap of pathogens in these dead lambs. We had 2 of these aborted lambs. And again, these were from flocks which had effectively abortion outbreaks. And what we did is we followed that up or supplemented that with 33 stillborn lambs, which were from farms with and without abortion. Now, notably, what we identified was that Chlamydia pecorum, which is a bacteria that we don't really know a lot about, was detected in 64% of the, let's say, the fetuses and the stillborn lambs born to ewe lambs, and 8% from the hoggets. But importantly, it was detected on 5 out of 6 farms in Western Australia. And we've since identified, or it's since been identified on farms in South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, and New South Wales. So certainly there are now, at the same time, there were outbreaks being reported in New South Wales. So we were able to rule out or eliminate the other common infections, so things like the Campylobacter, Listeria, Toxoplasma, Q fever, with testing. And again, it's the Chlamydia pecorum that we need to understand more about, the role that it's playing, particularly with these mid-pregnancy abortions and the birth of lambs which are, say, small or weak and then fail to get up and feed well. So when we talk about Chlamydia pecorum, there's different types of chlamydia pecorum in the same way that we've got different variants of COVID. And the sequence type, we call it the sequence type 23, is the one now that we've now isolated in abortions and stillbirths in Western Australia and New South Wales. We've also identified this same, let's say this dangerous variant, let's say, in arthritic joints from let's say the brothers and sisters of the lambs that were stillborn or aborted on the same farm. So again, these were animals that were not fit to load for slaughter, and we've recovered, because they've got arthritis, and we've recovered that. And also in cases of pink eye. Now, it's also the same sequence type that causes abortion in cattle and a disease called sporadic bovine encephalomyelitis. So we now know that this is what we call a pathogenic or a disease-causing strain, and we suspect that this could be explaining some of these cases of mid-pregnancy abortions or abortions and stillbirths where previously we weren't able to get a diagnosis. So the key findings of our, these more detailed laboratory investigations and postmortems are that mid-pregnancy abortions are really hard to detect. We rarely recover lambs, and so we rarely get samples being sent into the laboratory. So most of the data and the information that we have on what are the common causes of fetal loss are related to these late pregnancy abortions, because that's what the laboratories have received. So we still don't have a lot of information on what are these causes of these early and mid-pregnancy abortions that you might be seeing as scanners. Where a cause is found, it's most likely to be an infection, and this is for two reasons. These infections do cause these late-term abortions, where farmers are likely to find the lambs and submit them to a laboratory, and also because the laboratories have tests that they can do, so a PCR test or a culture, and identify the cause. Much harder to identify, say, a nutritional cause or something like a heat stress and things like that. We know that younger ewes are more susceptible to these infections, and that these can then cause abortion and weak lambs. So again, this goes some way to explaining why we see more of these fetal losses in these younger ewes, and also why we get poorer lamb survival in, particularly in the ewe lambs. Campylobacter, Listeria and Toxoplasma are diagnosed, across Australia, and typically the most common causes. But again, just recognising that that's because these are diseases that can cause these later term abortions, certainly can cause mid or early and mid pregnancy abortions, but again, the laboratories don't receive that. So again, our feedback is that if farmers, scanners, vets are getting reports of any aborted lambs, that those should be collected, including the placenta wherever possible, and then basically storing that safely for lab testing if the labs, if the government vets are happy to approve that. Also, again, if we don't get the aborted lambs, we can still get really useful information out of stillborn and weak lambs. So again, this is something we encourage farmers. If we know that they're getting problems, losses occurring during pregnancy, that they don't recover any of those aborted lambs, is still considered collecting and submitting some of the stillborn and weak lambs. And in every state of Australia, there's subsidised testing available so that we can exclude exotic diseases. Something is a bit of a watch this space is we know that this, this tricky strain of Chlamydia pecorum is common and widespread in Australia, and we need some more information about whether this is an important cause of reproductive disease. Again, it's not a new infection, it's just that we're now able to test for it. And finally, these Campylobacter outbreaks can occur sporadically and under the right conditions, where we've got basically susceptible sheep in the right environment, but the blood tests can be tricky to interpret and need to be interpreted carefully. So vaccination for Campylobacter does or can reduce losses on some farms in some years, but not all farms and not every year. And it doesn't represent a silver bullet for lamb survival. So we need to look at Campylobacter, but also beyond Campylobacter. So our take-home messages from these studies is that, yes, it's important to measure reproductive scanning rate and lamb survival in maidens, because that informs the strategies that are going to allow us to improve marking rates overall. Abortions are more common, particularly in new lambs, than previously thought, and these will readily go undetected. So we managed to basically detect these with repeat scanning, and that's the strategy. We've now got protocols for that repeat scanning to be used for farms where we suspect that abortion is a problem. Any signs of abortion warrant investigation, so particularly where we've got lambs being, premature lambs, lambs being slipped during pregnancy, and consider, submitting these for the subsidised testing programs and the surveillance testing, because the laboratories and the state labs are really interested now in looking at these causes of abortion. So for farms with disappointing lamb survival, discussing lamb postmortems with the vet, again, so we can get those key samples to look for the infectious causes, and considering repeat scanning to detect that mid-pregnancy abortion, particularly in maidens. The maidens are more susceptible to these infections. So again, that explains why we're more likely to be seeing these mid-pregnancy abortions in the ewe lambs. And knowing when the losses are occurring and why allows us to give effective strategies to improve performance. So if the problem is dystocia, that will have quite different solutions to if the problem is an infectious cause of abortion. So finally, I'd like to thank, basically it was a big team that have contributed to all of these studies. It was an MLA funded project, but with a lot of in-kind support from the state laboratories, particularly in Western Australia. AWI contributed basically a prize for Tom Clune, which ended up supporting a lot of that chlamydia work. And we had really great partners in each of the states, which were collecting, collecting the samples and supporting the work. So we do have contacts in, around Australia that have actually implemented this repeat scanning protocol and that can provide you some feedback on how they did it. What are the things that they learned from that?
So I'm a research scientist with New South Wales DPI. I've been working here at the Cowra office since 2008. And I've been working on projects across a range of fields from meat science, genetics, wool production, nutrition, reproduction, disease case studies, and technology development. My focus is principally sheep and goat reproduction and a real focus on industry profitability. Okay, so a part of my understanding for where the industry is headed in terms of projects that can background or preface this particular program that we're involved with at the moment, that's been led by Forbes, is that there are scanning workshops available for new entry scanners, and they're refresher workshops. And in some of the larger scale businesses, the very experienced scanners will bring in their new scanners and bring them along and train them. But that's not necessarily available for everybody all the time. And sometimes if you move into a particular environment, or that's where you're working, and you tend to do a lot of empty in-lamb scanning rather than looking for litter size, then you may not recall necessarily the experiences of seeing something in your early days training around things like fetal reabsorption or some of the various quirks that you might see, or higher order litter sizes. So what we've tried to do is collect video resources that we can then post online, that you'll be able to go to and click on at any time. And they're different from a still photograph. This is videos being captured. So this is the intention of this work. So it's really about developing visual aids for entry-level and novice scanners, but also it's a reminder or a refresher for those scanners that are experienced. Last year, in the first national workshop that we held online for scanners, Kiro was talking about some of the different things that you see, and I got some feedback quite recently from a pregnancy scanner who has 18 years of experience, and he was saying it was really terrific for him to see some of the things that he's recognized in his scans over time, but wasn't really sure what it was, and it's just confirmed that he was on the money in his thoughts and his recognition. So it's about creating a resource, and we've done this with Oviscan 6 mostly, because it's the most common machine, and that makes sense for the majority of the users that will look on these resources. And also in capturing videos, we've brought in the real world element. So if the animals aren't scanning very well because we've got contact issues, or if the ewes haven't necessarily been prepared terribly well, then that's just a part of what we're seeing, right? So it's a little more real world, and I think that's got some value. We've collected 103 videos. In them, we're either focusing on litter size, for example, anywhere from an empty ewe through to up to quintuplets. There's about 65 videos where we've identified a litter size as a part of the title in the video. We've collected video fetal age on about 23, and then we've got a handful of anomalies like fetal reabsorption. We've got uterine bleeds, possible hydrometras, possible ectopic pregnancies. And then we've also added a little bit of training in there around how to connect to a TrueTest XR5000 or a Gallagher and some examples of how power and gain might be used in certain circumstances or range. So what I've done now is, with the terrific assistance of my technical officer, Jackie Chapman, and thanks very much to Simon de Graaf and Kiro and a number of pregnancy scanners that have allowed us to tag along and connect our gear, or even just hold our iPhone in against their scanning machines to collect the information and to have the conversation recorded. So that's how I collected 103 different videos. But what I've done for this presentation, it's about 6 minutes in its duration. I've collected 8 videos and we've just stitched them together, and we've got a little screen indicating what the video is going to be about and some of the metrics. And this is how we'll set up a standard for most of these videos. So what I'm going to do now is change my video over, and I'll pull you up to full screen. So these will be the videos. And there'll be some sound. The first couple of videos don't have much sound, but there will be sound coming in other videos. I'll just play that. And this is sort of what we're trying to achieve for some of these videos, and not for all of them. So we've got annotation talking about the sorts of things that we see in the scan, pointing out amniotic fluid, parts of the placentomes, of course, where the uterine wall might be. We've got some examples of metaregia. This ewe aborted basically in the scanning crate, which was quite extraordinary. In this particular video, we've got the pregnancy scanner pointing to their Oviscan monitor, and you can see my hand in there holding an iPhone recording the voice. So we have video from iPhone, voice from iPhone. We also have a cable connected into the Oviscan monitor that's feeding out to this device where we're recording video itself. So these videos come with some discussion from the pregnancy scanners. There's a lot of value actually sometimes in just hearing them talk about what they see on the screen and in their experience. These beautiful examples of uterine wall and the placentomes. You've got nice quality placentomes. In some of these examples where we have fetal reabsorption being queried, you see those placentomes basically drying out.
That's right for that. That's about a 90-day fetus now.
So we've got some discussion in those videos around the fetal age, and in as many of the videos as we can, we've got the age of the gestation.
Yep.
And what are you seeing there, James?
Yeah, there's 3, so there's like one here, one at the right at the bottom, one in the middle, just there, and then come up the top, and there's another one there.
Yep.
So they're 50 days.
So we've got.
You can see the variation in the quality of the image
in the same pocket. So you got
which
one
is a
here,
function of the job itself.
and then you got this pocket that's full of
Full of stardust.
yeah.
So it probably was triplets.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know enough to say that, but
Material
it's just
in this little amniotic sac,
and that's what like
implying, of course, that there's been a reabsorbed fetus.
And you've had a few of them this year.
Yeah, but that's just there's a good like 2 lambs in the one pocket with the other pocket just nothing going on. But
So here we think,
yeah, like there could have been something in there, and it's just
one pocket,
absorbing it or something.
and in the other one, we're not sure what it is. Is it twins? Is it triplets?
So we come on and we got a
Okay.
ninth Elsie single on the right,
Yes.
and then we go to this pocket here, and there is a lamb in there, but it's just a very distorted image, and yeah, not much sort of.
So it becomes a grey pixelation in the colouring rather than a sort of a solid bone, or what are we looking
Yeah,
at?
it's because it's very young.
So this particular
Video
video has quite a bit more discussion about it.
Come in, we got a healthy
But we
one
think
here.
one
so
viable
normally
fetus
the fetuses
and
should
one
be sort of
reabsorbed.
size.
Yes.
So like this one on the right's really healthy,
Yes.
and you come onto the, and this one's just a very.
Yeah, much
It's
smaller.
The arrows on the screen are indicating
Yep.
what we're
You
talking
get
about.
this, we call it
haven't
sort of
done the arrows
stardust in
on every video.
in that pocket,
Yes.
that grey flecky stuff. So
We're changing the range.
you can see the
getting
bone
closer.
structure there.
Yes.
So like, I still think it's viable, but it could pass away.
So what will you call it?
Yeah, yeah, on the fence you could call it a single or you could call it twin, but normally I put a single and put a line.
So this is a discussion
yeah,
about
so then if
how do you manage this animal? How do you tell the farmer and manage their expectations
or,
that this animal
you
could
know,
have
that's
twins,
what's going on, or if she loses,
might have a single, and it might not even lamb at all. And so how do we identify that? How do we translate the expectations and manage the reproductive wastage? And which number do you count? And this is just the last of the video. So this is a real-time pregnancy scanning. What we've done in our editing for the purposes of this particular presentation is to remove the dead air time when we're waiting for the sheep to exit the crate or to enter the crate. But once we've got the animal in the crate and the contact is there, this is how long it's taking this particular preg scanner to identify litter size. So now I'm not a qualified scanner, and I can tell you that it's pregnant, but I'm not good enough to pick up litter size at that speed. The value I think in this scanning is really for producers, which is to say the scanner is doing a job for you as quick as you can with the highest levels of accuracy that's being requested. So if we're looking for multiples, we've got to slow down. If it's just for twins, we've got a different speed. If we're doing empties in lamb, it's a different speed. And when you've got a farmer that's got staff pushing animals into the crate and in the stockyards, the farmer doesn't want to be around there forever. The scanner doesn't want to be around there forever. So at some point in the middle here, there is an optimum speed to give the optimum accuracy. And the value of these chain speed type of videos that we've collected is really about saying how quickly a decision's being made, and we're all relying on the accuracy of it. And so it's a wonderful skill, and that just demonstrates the point. So it's probably only got a couple of seconds to go. So I'll just let that run out, and that'll be the end of my presentation. Look, what I want to do is wrap up the presentations and the webinar. Thanks very much for all the scanners who attended and for your contribution over the chat. Thanks very much to the speakers. I think it's been quite a good workshop. There's been a lot of information come together there, and I hope that it's met everybody's expectations. We'll be sending out some sort of form of communication to find out how you evaluate this webinar, and I'm very keen for your active feedback on that. And so now what I'll do is I'll draw the webinar to a close and thank everyone for your time. I look forward to your feedback. Thanks very much.